Rebecca Hamilton pushed open the wooden door of Morrison's general store on the evening of September 12, 1978. The bell above the door rang softly as she stepped outside, clutching a small paper bag. Inside it were a chocolate bar, a soda, and the latest teen magazine she had picked from a rack. She tucked the bag close to her chest, pulled her denim jacket tighter against the cool air, and began the familiar walk home along County Road 35. The road was quiet. Only the distant hum of crickets and the faint rumble of a tractor echoed across the fields. Rebecca's shoes crunched against the gravel as she moved forward. The sun had already dipped below the horizon, leaving streaks of orange fading into gray. A light drizzle hung in the air, dampening the edges of her jacket, but she walked with purpose. She had made this trip many times before. Tonight should have been no different. As she passed the old Miller barn, she noticed a truck parked near the edge of the road. Its engine was off, its windows dark. Rebecca kept her eyes ahead and quickened her pace. It was not unusual to see farm vehicles parked along the lanes, but something about its stillness lingered in her mind. She clutched the bag tighter and walked faster. A neighbor, Mrs. Keller, drove by around that time. She remembered later seeing Rebecca walking briskly with her head down. It was the last verified sighting of the 16-year-old. Moments later, County Road 35 fell silent again. The drizzle grew heavier, washing away footprints in the soft gravel. At home, Rebecca's mother, Margaret Hamilton, expected to hear the door creak open any minute. Dinner plates were still on the table, waiting for her daughter to return. The hours slipped by. By 10 o'clock, the porch light glowed across the yard, but Rebecca had not come home. Margaret told herself that Rebecca may have stopped by a friend's house. By 11, she began calling neighbors. None had seen her. When midnight struck, Margaret entered Rebecca's room. The bed was neatly made, untouched. Her school books sat stacked on the desk, and the window was closed against the drizzle. The silence of the room pressed against her chest. Rebecca was not home, and every instinct told Margaret something was terribly wrong. She called the sheriff's office just after midnight. Deputy Frank Larson arrived within minutes. He walked through the house, checked the yard, and listened to Margaret's trembling account. Rebecca had left the store at dusk. She should have been home before dark. Now, nearly 6 hours later, there was no sign of her. Larson drove the length of County Road 35 with his headlights sweeping across the gravel. At the ditch near the Miller barn, he spotted something small and crumpled. He stopped the car and stepped into the wet grass. It was a brown paper bag, damp from the drizzle. Inside were a half-melted chocolate bar and a wrinkled teen magazine. The soda bottle was shattered nearby. The discovery tightened the sense of dread. Rebecca had carried this bag from Morrison's. She had dropped it here, and now she was gone. By 2 a.m, the Hamilton family's quiet farmhouse had filled with neighbors, deputies, and volunteers. Flashlights cut across the fields, voices called Rebecca's name, and dogs strained at their leashes. But the night gave nothing back. The gravel road, the drizzle, the silent truck, all of it lingered as unanswered questions. Each passing minute felt heavier than the last. Margaret stood on the porch, clutching her son Daniel's hand, her eyes fixed on the darkness beyond the yard. The search stretched until dawn, but Rebecca did not return. What began as an ordinary walk home from the store had become the start of a nightmare. And by sunrise on September 13, 1978, the small farming community of Galesburg faced a chilling truth. A 16-year-old girl had vanished into night, and no one knew where she had gone. The mystery of her disappearance was only beginning to unfold. Rebecca Hamilton was more than a name in a missing persons report. She was a girl full of promise, a teenager whose laughter often carried to the quiet streets of Galesburg. At 16, she stood at the edge of adulthood, her future waiting to be shaped. Those who knew her remembered a girl with ambition, warmth, and a kindness that seemed effortless. She lived with her mother, Margaret, and her younger brother, Daniel, in a modest white farmhouse on the outskirts of town. Rebecca's father had passed away when she was very young, and from that loss grew an unbreakable bond between Margaret and her children. Margaret often described Rebecca as her second pair of hands, someone who managed household chores, helped with Daniel's schoolwork, and still found time to chase her own dreams. Rebecca dreamed of becoming a teacher. She loved school, not only for her own learning, but for the chance to help others. Neighbors recalled her spending afternoons tutoring younger children at the library, sitting patiently beside them as they struggled with their reading. Her voice was calm, her encouragement steady. To the children of the town, she was not just a babysitter, but a role model. She adored music, especially the soft folk songs that drifted from the radio late at night. Her room was lined with posters of popular singers of the late 1970s, and her small record player often spun vinyl as she did her homework. Books, too, were her passion. Her favorite was To Kill a Mockingbird, a story she carried around until the edges of its cover curled. She once told her mother that the book made her believe in fairness, even when life seemed unjust. Rebecca's denim jacket became part of her identity. She wore it through summer nights and autumn winds, its sleeves often rolled up, its fabric worn soft from use. The jacket carried faint scents of the perfume she borrowed from Margaret, and the faint ink smudges from pens she always carried in its pocket. Friends said that seeing Rebecca without that jacket was rare, as if it was a shield she carried into the world. Her kindness extended beyond her family. She regularly helped elderly neighbors carry groceries, walked dogs for friends who were busy, and volunteered during church events. One farmer recalled her stopping by his field to help pick up scattered apples after a storm. She did not think twice, he later said. That was Rebecca. She saw a need and she stepped in. Despite her sense of responsibility, she was still a teenager who laughed easily and found joy in simple moments. She loved baking cookies with Daniel, teasing him when he tried to steal the dough. She enjoyed writing in her diary, filling its pages with dreams of traveling, teaching, and one day seeing the world beyond Galesburg. To her mother, she was a daughter who brought comfort in times of hardship. To her brother, she was a protector, someone who made him feel safe. To her community, she was a bright light, a reminder that goodness could exist in everyday life. And when that light vanished, the void it left was impossible to ignore. The last confirmed sighting of Rebecca Hamilton was just after dusk on September 12, 1978. She walked steadily along County Road 35, a familiar path she had taken countless times before. The gravel crunched beneath her shoes as the evening sky darkened, and a light drizzle began to fall. In her hand, she still carried the paper bag from Morrison's General Store. Inside were the simple treasures of a teenager's evening: candy, a soda, and a magazine. Several witnesses later confirmed seeing her. Mrs. Keller, a neighbor driving home from visiting relatives, recalled passing Rebecca near the old Miller barn. Rebecca kept her head down, the collar of her denim jacket pulled tight against the cool air. She looked like a girl hurrying home before the rain fell harder. Another man, a farmer named Harold Dean, reported seeing a truck parked not far from the same stretch of road. Its color was green, its frame older, possibly a pickup used for hauling supplies. He thought little of it at the time. Farm trucks were common in the area, and it did not seem unusual. But in the hours that followed, that detail would become chilling. Within minutes, Rebecca disappeared. When Margaret Hamilton realized her daughter had not returned, the first thought was a delay. Perhaps Rebecca had visited a friend. Perhaps she had stopped to chat with a neighbor. But as the hours stretched into night, those simple explanations began to crumble. Rebecca was responsible, careful, and never stayed out late without telling her mother. Something was wrong. The sheriff's office was contacted just after midnight. Deputy Frank Larson responded, arriving in the drizzle that now covered the gravel roads in a thin film of water. He retraced the path Rebecca should have walked. His headlights swept across the ditches, the fields, the darkened outlines of barns. Near the Miller property, something caught his eye. A paper bag lay damp in the grass. Inside was a chocolate bar, partly crushed, and a wrinkled magazine with faded ink running from moisture. A broken soda bottle lay nearby, its glass glistening in the light of his flashlight. It was the first real sign that Rebecca had never made it home. The discovery sent a shiver through the investigation. Was she taken by someone waiting in that truck? Did she run off into the fields, only to drop the bag? Or had something far worse unfolded in those silent minutes along the road? Speculation grew quickly. Some wondered if Rebecca had chosen to run away, but those who knew her rejected the idea. She had no reason to disappear. She was close to her family, dedicated to school, and had left her diary, clothing, and savings untouched. The second possibility was darker. Abduction. The parked truck, the scattered belongings, and the silence of the road all suggested she may have been forced into a vehicle. If that were true, the question became who and why. Foul play hovered over every theory. If someone had taken her, was she alive, or had her journey ended in violence before she even left County Road 35? By 2 a.m, the search had grown. Neighbors joined deputies with flashlights, their beams cutting across rows of corn and patches of wet grass. Voices echoed through the night, calling Rebecca's name, waiting for an answer that never came. Dogs were brought in, their noses pressed to the ground where the bag had been found. The drizzle, however, had washed away most of the scent. The Hamilton farmhouse became the search headquarters. Margaret stood on the porch clutching Daniel's hand, her eyes fixed on the dark fields. Each car that pulled up brought more volunteers, more prayers, more urgency. The community understood that every passing hour without Rebecca lessened the chance of finding her safe. By dawn, exhaustion spread through the searchers. The fields yielded no trace. No footprints, no clothing, no sign of struggle. Only the bag and the broken bottle remained as silent witnesses to whatever had happened. The sheriff gathered his deputies at sunrise. He told them what everyone already feared. Rebecca Hamilton had not simply wandered off. Something had happened to her on that lonely stretch of County Road 35. The unanswered questions multiplied. Who was in that truck? Why had Rebecca's belongings been scattered? Yet no one had heard a scream or seen a struggle. And where was she now? The road that had once been a safe path home had become the center of a nightmare. And with the first light of September 13th, the small farming community of Galesburg awoke to a chilling reality. The 16-year-old girl had vanished into the night, and the evidence left behind whispered only of danger. The panic was only beginning. The first 72 hours are often the most crucial in any missing persons case. For Rebecca Hamilton, those hours began in darkness, with the sound of dogs barking and neighbors sweeping their flashlights across wet fields. The drizzle of September 12th had given way to a misty morning on September 13th, but the fear in Galesburg only deepened. Sheriff Thomas Keller, a man who had spent more than 2 decades in rural law enforcement, stood on County Road 35 at dawn. The discarded paper bag lay secured in an evidence bag, its contents a painful reminder of Rebecca's unfinished walk home. He knew time was already slipping away. Every hour without answers gave whoever had taken Rebecca more distance, more cover, and more chances to vanish. By mid-morning, the sheriff's department had mobilized. Deputies spread out across the cornfields, while volunteers combed through wooded patches and drainage ditches. Search dogs strained against their leashes, noses pressed to the wet gravel where Rebecca's belongings had been found. The scent was faint, nearly washed away by the drizzle, but handlers urged the dogs forward. Trails led only a few yards before vanishing in confusion. At the general store, clerks were questioned. Mrs. Morrison remembered Rebecca clearly. She had bought candy, a soda, and a magazine just before dusk. She had smiled politely, thanked her, and walked out alone. There had been no one waiting inside, no conversation that suggested concern. To the clerks, it had been an ordinary evening, until it became anything but. Detectives moved quickly to Rebecca's classmates. At the high school, students whispered nervously in hallways. Some admitted seeing her earlier that afternoon, chatting with friends, laughing, carrying her books with ease. None noticed anything unusual. She had not seemed upset. She had made no mention of running away. She had spoken about finishing her homework and looking forward to the weekend football game. Meanwhile, tips began pouring into the sheriff's office. Most were vague sightings, shadows in the dark, figures walking along the road. But one stood out. Farmer Harold Dean reported the truck he had seen near the Miller barn on the very road Rebecca vanished. He described it as a green pickup, older in model, parked oddly close to the ditch. Its presence at that hour, combined with Rebecca's disappearance, made it more than just another detail. Deputies circulated the description to nearby towns, but it was too little to go on. The first wave of suspicion fell on local men with criminal records. One, a mechanic known for alcohol-related offenses, was brought in for questioning. Another, a drifter who had recently been seen near the rail yard, was tracked down and interrogated. Both denied any involvement. Their alibis were thin, but no evidence tied them to Rebecca. The questioning consumed precious hours, leaving investigators with nothing but frustration. As daylight faded on September 13th, the search grew. More volunteers arrived, carrying lanterns and ropes, wading through marshy fields. Helicopters borrowed from the state police hovered overhead, scanning for movement in the fields below. Yet Rebecca remained invisible, as if the night had swallowed her whole. Inside the Hamilton home, the atmosphere was unbearable. Margaret clung to every update from the sheriff, her eyes red from lack of sleep. Daniel asked questions no one could answer. Where was his sister? Why had she not come back? The silence in Rebecca's room became heavier with each passing hour. By the second day, investigators turned to broader canvassing. Deputies knocked on doors across Galesburg, asking residents if they had seen or heard anything unusual. Some mentioned hearing a vehicle engine rev around dusk, though none could describe it clearly. Others recalled barking dogs, but dismissed it at the time. Each detail hinted at a larger picture, but none formed a complete answer. On the third day, Sheriff Keller called in assistance from the Michigan State Police. Their forensic team examined the paper bag and soda bottle. Fingerprint powder revealed smudges, but none clear enough to match. Fibers were collected from the bag. Though without modern DNA technology, little could be done in 1978. The sheriff knew they were at the mercy of limited resources. Tension grew as rumors spread. Some in town whispered that Rebecca had run away with a secret boyfriend. Others believed the stranger had passed through, taking advantage of the quiet roads. Still others feared someone local, someone trusted, had hidden behind a mask of normalcy. The first 72 hours closed with no answers. The green pickup remained a phantom. The scattered belongings the only evidence. The sheriff stood once more on County Road 35, staring at the empty ditch. He understood what the community already felt. The safe rhythm of their small town had been shattered. Rebecca Hamilton had vanished, and the trail was already slipping into silence. The case that began with urgency was about to transform into a long, painful battle against time. The disappearance of Rebecca Hamilton spread through Galesburg faster than the morning frost on the fields. What began as whispers in the aisles of Morrison's general store soon became the only subject on everyone's lips. By the end of the week, the entire town felt transformed. Ordinary routines now carried a shadow that no one could ignore. Parents who once allowed their children to walk to school now insisted on driving them, their eyes scanning every intersection and quiet stretch of road. Children who once played freely in the open yards were called inside before dusk. Trust, once taken for granted in a small farming community, was quickly replaced with suspicion. Storefronts that usually advertised seed prices and harvest festivals were now plastered with posters of Rebecca's smiling face. Each one carried the same haunting question, "Have you seen me?" Neighbors helped distribute the flyers, but each time they pinned one to a wall or telephone pole, it reminded them that one of their own was gone without a trace. For Rebecca's family, the days stretched into an unbearable fog. Margaret Hamilton kept the porch light burning every night, convinced her daughter would see it as a beacon and return home. The bulb glowed like a silent prayer across the yard, a fragile act of hope that refused to die. Inside, Margaret's hands trembled as she folded laundry that no one would wear again, her heart caught between denial and dread. Daniel, Rebecca's younger brother, withdrew into silence. Once cheerful and talkative, he now avoided walking alone anywhere. Friends noticed he lingered in groups, constantly glancing over his shoulder. His teachers reported he no longer raised his hand in class. The disappearance had stolen not only his sister, but also his sense of safety. At church, vigils became weekly gatherings. Families lit candles, bowed their heads, and prayed for Rebecca's safe return. The sound of hymns filled the sanctuary, but behind each note was a deeper current of fear. If something so terrible could happen to Rebecca, it could happen to any child in Galesburg. The town that once prided itself on being a place where doors were left unlocked now felt stalked by an unseen predator. Rumors spread quickly. Some whispered about strangers seen loitering near the highway. Others speculated about local men with bad reputations. Every unfamiliar vehicle drew suspicion, and every face at the diner seemed to be studied twice. Fear turned neighbors into wary observers of one another. Despite the tension, the community's unity remained strong. Farmers set aside hours to help with searches. Mothers prepared meals for the Hamiltons, leaving covered dishes on their porch when Margaret was too overwhelmed to answer the door. Teenagers gathered in groups to hand out leaflets in nearby towns. Each gesture was a small rebellion against despair, a way of saying they would not abandon Rebecca, no matter how many days passed. Still, as the weeks moved forward without answers, a chilling reality settled over Galesburg. Hope remained, but was fragile, threatened each night by silence. The community had changed forever, its innocence broken, and in the Hamilton household, that glowing porch light burned on, waiting for a girl who had vanished into the dark. In the weeks following Rebecca Hamilton's disappearance, Galesburg became a place consumed by rumors. Every conversation carried a theory. Every passing stranger was eyed with suspicion. People longed for answers, but in the absence of truth, speculation filled the silence. The first whispers centered around Rebecca's social circle. Some wondered if her boyfriend, a 17-year-old named Michael Turner, knew more than he admitted. He had been the last young man to walk her home from school days before she vanished. Detectives questioned him repeatedly, pressing about arguments, jealousy, or hidden conflicts. Michael denied everything, his voice shaking under the weight of accusation. His alibi, helping his father repair a tractor, was confirmed. Yet for weeks, his reputation carried the stain of doubt. In the close quarters of Galesburg, that suspicion lingered long after the police moved on. Attention then shifted outward. Travelers often passed through on County Road 35, and many residents whispered about drifters, men with no ties who could disappear as quickly as they arrived. Gas station attendants described unfamiliar faces, strangers buying cigarettes or asking for directions. Each account painted the image of an outsider capable of unspeakable harm. Deputies followed these reports, stopping vagabonds, writing down names, and filing notes. None of them led to Rebecca. One lead struck closer to home and nearly broke the Hamilton family spirit. A neighbor, Harold Briggs, was arrested after a tip suggested he had been seen near the general store on the night Rebecca vanished. Harold was a middle-aged man with a solitary lifestyle, often regarded as odd by others. His sudden detention sent shockwaves through the town. For 2 days, rumors spread that the case was solved. Yet investigators found no evidence, no connection, and no motive. Harold was released, his name forever scarred by suspicion. The Hamiltons, who had known him for years, felt another layer of heartbreak. Not only was Rebecca still missing, but now a man from their community had been unjustly shamed. Detectives pursued another lead involving a traveling salesman. Witnesses recalled a green sedan parked along the highway in the days before Rebecca disappeared. The driver, a salesman selling encyclopedias, was tracked across several counties. Detectives interrogated him late into the night. He admitted to being in the area, but insisted he had left town before September 12th. Receipts and motel records confirmed his claim. Once again, what had seemed promising dissolved into nothing. Then came a tip that carried cruel hope. A woman in Chicago reported seeing a girl who looked like Rebecca boarding a bus. The description matched closely. Young, slim, long brown hair, wearing a denim jacket. Detectives hurried to Chicago, distributing Rebecca's photo at bus stations, diners, and shelters. For months, the lead consumed valuable time and resources. Every phone call from Chicago was answered with urgency. Margaret Hamilton clung to the possibility that her daughter was alive in the city. But each search ended in disappointment. By the time the tip was declared unfounded, the Hamilton family was drained, their hearts crushed by yet another false promise. The pattern repeated again and again. A classmate claimed Rebecca had talked about running away, though no one else could confirm it. A farmer reported hearing a scream near the cornfields, but nothing was ever found. Letters arrived in the mail. Some cruel hoaxes, others from psychics claiming visions of her location. Each piece of information was investigated. Each one collapsed under scrutiny. For the sheriff's department, the weight of these dead ends became overwhelming. Their resources were already thin. Their deputies stretched between farm duties and night patrols. Every false lead cost manpower, time, and morale. Detectives stared at maps dotted with pins, a patchwork of theories that led nowhere. Files grew thicker, but the truth seemed further away. For the Hamilton family, the emotional toll was unbearable. Margaret described the torment as being trapped between hope and grief, never able to settle in either. One moment she clutched the phone, believing the next call might bring news. The next, she collapsed in tears, certain her daughter was gone forever. Daniel withdrew further, tired of hearing adults speculate about his sister. He stopped answering questions at school, frustrated by the constant attention. The town itself began to fray under the strain. Trust between neighbors grew weaker. Some believed the killer was among them. Others thought Rebecca had chosen to leave. No theory brought comfort, only more division. As months passed, the list of false leads became a haunting catalog of disappointment. Each one raised a fragile hope and then shattered it, deepening the darkness around Rebecca's case. By the end of that year, the Hamiltons were left with more questions than answers, their faith tested with every dead end. And in the heart of Galesburg, a chilling truth remained. Rebecca was still gone, and the trail leading to her was colder than ever. By the early 1980s, the search for Rebecca Hamilton had lost its momentum. What had once been an urgent manhunt was now a collection of aging files stacked inside the Kalamazoo County Sheriff's Department. The maps with pins marking possible sightings were taken down. The photographs faded under fluorescent light, and the deputies who had once walked the cornfield with flashlights moved on to other duties. Rebecca's case slipped quietly into the archives, becoming another cold file in a drawer of unsolved mysteries. For her family, the silence was unbearable. Margaret Hamilton, who had once rushed to the phone with every ring, now lived in a state of waiting that stretched on without end. Each September, she wrote letters to local newspapers, pleading for a reminder of her daughter's case, hoping that someone, somewhere, would remember Rebecca. Some editors published her words, short notices tucked into the back pages, but no new tips ever came. The lack of response weighed on Margaret, yet she refused to let her daughter's name disappear completely. Daniel, just 11 years old when his sister vanished, grew into a man under the shadow of absence. His teenage years were marked by frustration and grief that few could understand. While his friends planned futures, he carried the burden of a question that never left him. What happened to Rebecca? By the time he reached adulthood, that question had hardened into a quiet anger. He graduated, found work in a nearby factory, and later built a family of his own, but the void left by his sister's disappearance followed him like a shadow across every stage of his life. The 1980s passed, and with them the hope of fresh evidence. Detectives who had once promised Margaret that they would find her daughter retired or transferred. New officers glanced at the file, but saw a case that was decades old, with no leads to pursue. In an era before DNA databases, before digital records, Rebecca's disappearance seemed locked in a past that could not be touched. The 1990s brought no relief. Margaret attended vigils held for missing children across Michigan, holding Rebecca's photograph against her chest, reminding strangers that her daughter's case remained unresolved. Some families of the newly missing received television coverage and investigative spotlights. Margaret watched them speak on news broadcasts, their pain raw and fresh. She envied them for the attention, for the resources, even as she shared their grief. Rebecca's name, by then, was rarely spoken outside of Galesburg. For the town itself, time dulled the fear, but never erased the unease. Morrison's general store closed its doors, its shelves left bare. The building eventually boarded up. County Road 35 remained as it had always been, long, lonely, and lined with fields. But for those who remembered, the stretch of gravel was haunted ground. Every few years, someone would bring up Rebecca's name at the diner or after church, and the room would fall silent, each person recalling the night she never made it home. By the early 2000s, Margaret was an aging woman still living in the same farmhouse where she had raised her children. She kept Rebecca's denim jacket folded in her closet, untouched since 1978, the fabric carrying the scent of a life cut short. Each night, she switched on the porch light, a ritual of hope that her daughter might somehow return. Neighbors noticed, but they said nothing. It had become a symbol of grief that everyone in Galesburg quietly respected. Daniel, now a father himself, carried the story of his sister to his children. He told them about her love for music, about the way she always shared candy after school, about the smile that brightened even the most ordinary day. He wanted them to know her, not as a mystery, but as family. Yet beneath his words was a quiet sorrow that his children could see, a reminder that their uncle was a man forever haunted by loss. The silence of those decades was perhaps the cruelest part of all. No answers came, no justice, no closure. Time marched forward, but for the Hamilton family, the calendar seemed frozen on September 12, 1978. The world changed. The Cold War ended. Technology advanced. The internet connected communities across continents. But Rebecca's case remained exactly where it had been left. By the end of 4 decades, the Hamiltons had learned to live within the ache of uncertainty. Yet even as the years passed, Margaret and Daniel never surrendered to forgetting. To them, Rebecca was not just a name on a dusty file. She was a daughter, a sister, a life stolen from them. And though the trail was cold, they carried her memory forward, waiting for the day when silence might finally give way to truth. For more than 40 years, Rebecca Hamilton's disappearance sat buried under layers of dust in the archives of Michigan law enforcement. But in 2019, a quiet shift began within the Michigan State Police Cold Case Unit. New technology had changed what was once considered impossible. Evidence that had been sealed since 1978 was brought out of storage, opened under sterile lights, and re-examined with fresh eyes. Inside one of those boxes lay the denim jacket Rebecca was last seen wearing. The fabric carried decades of silence, folded carefully since the day deputies collected it. Among the fibers, tucked away by time, was a single strand of hair. It had been cataloged in 1978, noted in reports, but at that time, science had no way to unlock its secrets. Now, in a modern laboratory, that hair held the potential to speak for Rebecca in ways she never could. Technicians extracted DNA from the strand, amplifying it with precision tools that did not exist in the late 70s. The result was a partial profile, fragile, incomplete, yet enough to open a door. Traditional databases offered no direct match. The man who had crossed paths with Rebecca had never left his DNA in the state's criminal files. For a moment, it seemed another disappointment loomed. But forensic science had evolved beyond standard databases. Investigators turned to forensic genealogy, a technique that compared DNA against public ancestry records. Analysts built a digital family tree, tracing distant cousins, then narrowing the branches until a single family name began to surface. The Hamilton case, frozen for 4 decades, now had a faint but undeniable lead. Suspense grew within the cold case unit. After so many false starts, no one dared to declare victory too soon. Detectives pored over the genealogical connections, cross-checking records, tracing marriages and birth certificates. The trail wound back to Galesburg itself. The match pointed toward a family that had long been respected in the community, a name familiar to nearly everyone who had lived there. It was a shocking possibility. For years, suspicion had been cast on outsiders, strangers, drifters passing through. Now, the science suggested that Rebecca's killer might have been someone who had lived among them all along, hidden in plain sight. The revelation stirred both hope and dread. For Rebecca's family, it was the first true sign of progress in decades, a light breaking through years of darkness. For investigators, it was a turning point, but also a delicate balance. DNA could point the way, but building a case still required painstaking work. The evidence had to be airtight. Detectives began assembling the puzzle piece by piece. Old witness statements were revisited. Maps were studied again. Names once dismissed were reconsidered in the light of this new genetic clue. For the first time since 1978, momentum surged through the investigation. As news of the renewed effort reached the Hamilton family, emotions ran high. Margaret, now an elderly woman, received a phone call from the cold case unit. The officer explained that new technology had given him a reason to reopen Rebecca's file. Margaret listened in silence, her hands trembling, the porch light still glowing outside her farmhouse as it had for 41 years. Daniel, standing beside her, felt a rush of emotions, relief that something was finally happening, fear of what truths might come to light, and anger that it had taken so long. The year 2019 marked a moment when silence began to crack. Where traditional policing had failed, science was succeeding. The strand of hair, preserved for decades, had become a voice. And that voice whispered a name that would soon rock the town of Galesburg to its core. Detective Amy Rodriguez joined the Michigan State Police Cold Case Unit in 2019, just as forensic genealogy breathed new life into Rebecca Hamilton's file. Unlike many who had worked the case before her, Amy was not burdened by decades of frustration. She approached the file with fresh determination, convinced that buried within the stacks of reports lay details that had been overlooked. Night after night, she sat at her desk surrounded by aging folders, photographs, and transcripts yellowed with time. She read every line, from the earliest witness accounts to the fruitless tips from Chicago. She mapped Rebecca's last steps, reconstructing the timeline minute by minute. Where others saw dead ends, Amy saw opportunities. Her attention soon turned to the witness statements collected in the days after Rebecca's disappearance. One name appeared again and again: Charles Whitman, the owner of a hardware store in Galesburg. Whitman had been questioned briefly in 1978 after a farmer recalled seeing his green pickup near County Road 35. At the time, Whitman's reputation as a trusted businessman seemed to shield him. He insisted he had been home that evening, and deputies moved on. But as Amy compared his interviews, subtle inconsistencies emerged. In one report, he claimed he had been working late at the store. In another, he said he had been at home with his wife. The contradictions were small, easily missed by investigators rushing against time. But to Amy, they stood out like warning lights. Why would an innocent man's memory shift so easily? Driven by instinct, she dug deeper into Whitman's past. Employment records, property deeds, even minor traffic citations. She gathered everything she could find. Each late night at her desk pulled her closer to a truth that had eluded the town for 41 years. Amy's persistence was more than duty. It was personal. She believed every victim deserved a voice, no matter how much time had passed. Rebecca Hamilton's file was more than paper. It was a story of stolen life, and Amy refused to let it fade into silence. What began with a strand of hair was now anchored by human persistence. And as Amy followed the threads, suspicion was slowly tightening around one of Galesburg's most respected men. The breakthrough came quietly, but its weight was enormous. When the DNA from a hair strand was compared against a family tree constructed by forensic genealogy, the results narrowed to one man: Charles Whitman, the respected owner of Whitman's Hardware, a church volunteer, and a fixture of Galesburg for decades. Charles was the last name anyone expected to see connected to Rebecca Hamilton's case. Detective Amy Rodriguez knew the science was solid, but science alone was not enough. She needed Whitman's words, his reactions, his denial, or his confession. In September 2019, investigators invited him to the station under the pretense of clarifying old witness statements. At 72 years old, Whitman walked in with the same calm demeanor that had defined his public life. He greeted officers politely, sat down neatly, and adjusted his glasses with steady hands. At first, the questions were routine. Where had he been on the night of September 12, 1978? Did he recall seeing Rebecca near County Road 35? His answers mirrored those he had given decades earlier. He insisted he had been at home, insisted he knew nothing. But Amy pressed harder, laying the DNA results on the table in front of him. She explained the science, the match, the family line that pointed directly to him. For the first time, the mask slipped. His hands trembled. Hours passed in that small room. Whitman shifted from denial to silence, then to anger. Finally, when the weight of evidence became undeniable, he broke. His voice dropped low, heavy with resignation. He admitted that he had seen Rebecca walking along the road that night. He admitted offering her a ride, knowing she trusted him as a familiar face in town. When she realized his intentions and tried to resist, he attacked her. His words painted a moment of betrayal, so profound it cut through the years, as if it had happened yesterday. The man known for Sunday sermons and quiet generosity had hidden a monstrous truth behind his calm smile. The revelation sent shockwaves through the community. Neighbors who had shopped at his store for decades, who had trusted him with spare keys and advice, now struggled to comprehend the double life he had led. The idea that Rebecca's killer had stood among them for more than 40 years was almost too much to bear. For Margaret and Daniel, the confession was devastating yet undeniable. They finally had the answer they had waited decades to hear. The truth was darker than they imagined, but it was truth nonetheless. The calm, respected image of Charles Whitman shattered in that interrogation room. What remained was the reality of a predator who had hidden in plain sight, his crime cloaked by the very trust of the community he betrayed. In early 2020, the town of Galesburg awoke to news that would change its history forever. Charles Whitman, the man who had once been considered the backbone of the community, was arrested for the 1978 murder of Rebecca Hamilton. Police cars pulled into his quiet driveway at dawn, their lights flashing against the winter snow. Neighbors stepped outside in disbelief as officers led the 72-year-old man, handcuffed and pale, into the back of a patrol car. The shock rippled instantly through town. For decades, Whitman had been trusted. He fixed locks, donated to church drives, and handed out candy to children every Halloween. To see him accused of such a crime was almost unthinkable. Yet the DNA evidence was undeniable, and his own confession sealed his fate. When his trial began later that year, the courthouse overflowed with people. Journalists filled the benches, eager to report on the story of a small-town hardware store owner unmasked as a predator. Long-time residents crowded into the gallery, their faces etched with disbelief and sorrow. The Hamilton family sat in the front row, the weight of 41 years pressing heavily upon them. Margaret Hamilton, now frail with age, listened as prosecutors laid out the details of her daughter's final moments. Each word was painful, but at last, the silence that had haunted her life was broken. Daniel, seated beside her, kept his hand on hers as witness after witness described the lies Whitman had told and the truths the evidence revealed. For the community, the trial was like tearing open an old wound. Friends who had once spoken warmly of Whitman now struggled to reconcile the man they thought they knew what the monster revealed in court. Some shook their heads in silence. Others wept openly. Every testimony stripped away the illusion of his goodness, leaving only betrayal in its place. When Whitman finally stood to face the jury, he was no longer the confident businessman of Galesburg, but an aging man cornered by truth. His voice was flat as he acknowledged his guilt. The courtroom held its breath as the judge delivered the sentence, life in prison without parole. For the Hamilton family, the verdict was both relief and heartbreak. Tears streamed down Margaret's face, not just for the justice achieved, but for the years lost, for the birthdays missed, for the life her daughter never had. Daniel, too, wept silently, knowing that while justice had come, closure would always remain incomplete. As the gavel fell, the town of Galesburg seemed to exhale. Justice had been delayed for more than 4 decades, but it had not been denied. The truth had finally been spoken, and Rebecca Hamilton's name was no longer just a question in the shadows. Rebecca Hamilton's case is more than a story of crime and justice. It is a reminder that evil can exist behind the most trusted faces, hidden beneath smiles and reputations. For over 40 years, her family carried the unbearable weight of silence, never letting go of hope. Their persistence, joined with modern DNA science, prove that no matter how much time passes, truth can still find its way to light. Rebecca's denim jacket, preserved in an evidence box, became the key to unlocking justice. It symbolized both the fragility of evidence and the enduring possibility of answers. What was once a garment of innocence became a vessel for truth. Her story teaches us that cold cases are never truly closed. They wait, quietly, until someone cares enough to look again, to ask one more question, to test one more strand of hair. It shows how determination, combined with science, can breathe life into long-forgotten files. Rebecca never had the chance to live her dreams, but her memory now carries the power of resilience and justice. Her absence left a scar on her community, but her case leaves behind a lesson. That closure, though delayed, is still worth fighting for.